Hello and welcome. I'm Professor Lucas, and today we'll be discussing how we learn and remember with a focus on schema theory. This information is adapted from Chapter 5, Understanding and Remembering, in the textbook I wrote, College Composition and Reading, Information and Strategies. If you watch the 3-part introduction video on reading, seeing, and thinking, then you know we have expectations based on our past experiences and our knowledge that shape how we interpret our experiences. This helps us make sense of the vast amount of information we receive by creating patterns we can rely on. In fact, patterns underlie much of how we process and retain information. Today we'll be talking more about those patterns and how they work. However, before we do that, you'll take part in an activity that will help you see what's really going on and understand how schema theory makes sense of it. This activity will show how powerful our minds can be in controlling how we see or understand things. First, you will read a given text. Then, you'll listen to it being read and can take notes. And finally, you'll see what you can remember. First, take a moment to read the given text. Now, I will read the passage with a short pause between each sentence, and you're welcome to take whatever notes you can while I'm reading it to you. He is worried because there are many things that could go wrong. If the balloons popped, the sound wouldn't be able to carry, since everything would be too far away from the correct floor. A closed window would also prevent the sound from carrying, since the building she lives in is well insulated. Since the whole operation depends upon the steady flow of electricity, a break in the middle of the wire would also cause problems. Of course, he could shout, but his voice might not carry that far, and he shouldn't sound harsh or strained. An additional problem is that a string could break on the instrument. Then there would be no accompaniment to the message. It is clear that the best situation would involve less distance. Then there would be fewer potential problems. With face-to-face contact, the least number of things could go wrong. Now, I invite you to try and rewrite the passage as closely as you can to word for word. As you discovered, if you tried to write this word for word after simply reading it once and hearing it once, it's quite difficult. However, the addition of the picture makes everything click, since it allows you to see the pattern that it matches. Once you have context, everything falls into place. This is a serenade. It isn't exactly your typical serenade, which is done with an acoustic guitar or a boombox, but we have everything we need for it to fit the pattern. We all know there are a few things you have to have for the situation to count as a serenade. First, you have to have the one doing the serenading and the one listening. If there's only one person involved, it's not a serenade. In addition, a serenade has to involve music, usually a guitar of some sort, but sometimes a boombox or something less traditional. However, if you don't have music, you don't have a serenade. Finally, the message has to be one of love. The purpose of the serenade is to win over the listener romantically. If you're playing music outside someone's window to try and get them to buy you a new cell phone, it's not a serenade. As I mentioned earlier, patterns are the basis of how we learn and understand. This was demonstrated by how confusing the passage was before. So then, we have a blueprint or a script about how we expect something to go and what elements it needs to have in order to count. This blueprint or script is called a schema, and it helps provide us with a framework for understanding the things we experience. No one can remember all the details. Your schema tell you which are the most important ones, and those are what you file away in your brain. In other words, no one remembers everything. Rather, details are selected and an approximation of the text or the experience is built in your head. Which details did you pick and why? If you did choose to take notes, you probably relied on patterns or schemata you already had, which told you to focus on nouns and verbs, like string break, and ignore smaller grammatical words like the, an, on, etc. If you noticed that the passage was a list of potential problems, that would have been helpful for remembering them more effectively than if they seem like a bunch of unrelated statements. As this activity shows, when readers read, They will try to understand it through the patterns they've built up through their experiences with the world. You don't just add up the meanings of words to understand. You try to connect what you're reading with a familiar pattern. So then, a reader's schema, or collected blueprints from their experience with the world, lets them understand, learn, and remember everything, including ideas and details in a text. As we're overwhelmed with experiences, our mind automatically starts categorizing things and making connections, creating those schema or blueprints. Another important idea to take away from this activity is that your readers need to know what you're talking about to be able to understand, so make sure it's clear. You need to give context. Don't assume readers will automatically know. Let's take a closer look at the way we use patterns to help us understand. The official definition of a schema is the organization of knowledge about a particular concept. The schema contains the features or attributes that are associated with a category membership. Another way to think about it is that our brain works by grouping and connecting concepts to achieve understanding and make reasonable assumptions and interpretations. We use these schemata built from our prior knowledge to evaluate, predict, and identify. Each structure of grouped and related concepts is called a schema. More than one are called a schemata. To make this a little clearer, let's look briefly at a few of the different kinds of schemata. There are a lot of types, but we'll just mention a few of the primary ones. Event schemata can also be called cognitive scripts. These are how we expect a certain event to go, or how we deal with something. For example, if you go to a restaurant or to an 8-year-old's birthday party, you know in general how things are going to happen and what it's going to be like. If you're thirsty, you get something to drink. If you're tired, you might rest or maybe eat some candy. You have certain ways you respond when someone says, "How are you?" These can all be seen as processes, practices, or ways that we typically approach tasks, problems, events, or situations. To put it scientifically, these are the programs we call on when faced with a certain stimulus. Unsurprisingly, object schemata govern our expectations about objects. Imagine you're looking through a furniture catalog. You see the weirdest looking chair that you have ever seen in your life. However, you still know it's a chair because you know what something needs to have to be identified as a chair and what it can't have. A beanbag and the electric chair are both chairs, but a footstool or an ottoman isn't, even though you can sit on them. This is due to your object schema for chairs, which can help you identify whether something is or isn't a chair, even if you've never seen the object before. A person schema is about the attributes of a particular individual, such as skills, competencies, and values. This often takes the form of the personality that we attribute to that person, which can be based on superficial things like clothing and demeanor when we don't know someone, or more extensive experiences with how the person behaves when we do know them. Self-schema is generalizations or beliefs about yourself, separate from the present situation. This is essentially your self-concept, which is in essence perceptions of yourself in terms of traits, competencies, and values. Role schemata contains sets of role expectations. That is, how we expect an individual occupying a certain role to behave. For example, how does a grandmother act? A waiter at a fancy restaurant? A banker? A gangster? A cheerleader? A 12-year-old boy? If you think about it, you have expectations for all of these roles. There are other types of schemata as well, like emotional schemata that allow us to interpret our feelings. Are you happy or mad, frustrated or irritated? We've all lived lives rich with experiences and have developed literally millions of schemata to help us deal with it all. Schema are constructed through specific experiences. They begin as a simple network and develop into more complex structures that are more organized and contain more characteristics. For example, a toddler might think that any animal with 4 legs and a tail is a dog, whereas an older child knows the difference between dogs and cats, and an adult knows about the various breeds of dogs and their connection to wolves. Schemata involving behavior and action can be acquired either directly or indirectly. You can acquire your blueprint or expectations directly by experiencing the process with confirmation through repetition. For example, you've probably eaten at restaurants lots of times, so you've had your experiences about how a normal restaurant visit goes confirmed. You can also build a schema through indirect experience, such as reading or listening to a story or a myth, watching a movie, hearing about it from another person, seeing someone else experience it, and so on. Since a schema is kind of like a blueprint indicating what's expected, you can create visual representations of a schema by listing the elements. What does a birthday party include? A visit to a restaurant? What is a dog? Now, when you eat at a specific restaurant or attend a specific birthday party or see a specific dog, you don't have to memorize everything about it. There are certain qualities or elements that you know have to be included. These qualities are like slots or blanks that can be filled in. For example, being seated in a restaurant might happen in a variety of ways, from seating yourself at the bar to having a host or hostess seat you at a booth or table. Information that fits the slot is readily learned with little mental effort, and the underlying form doesn't have to be relearned each time. You draw on that existing foundation knowledge. Some slots are more or less important than others, and our schema includes that information. We can process information that doesn't fit the stereotype as long as it fits the slot. For example, you can have a serenade accompanied by a xylophone or no accompaniment at all and still have a serenade, but you have to have someone being sung to, because without an audience, it doesn't qualify as a serenade. You can also tell how a person thinks and what their experiences have been like by the schema connections they have. Psychologists will use free association to tap into this because what you'll come up with are the connections that are the strongest. This illustration is drawn from one I did in class when I asked people to shout out the basic characteristics of a dog. The person who had said slobber as one of the identifying aspects has some obvious differences from the person who said cuddly. So, why is schema theory important? What are the benefits of our mind working this way? Find out all about how we actually use schemata to help us in the next mini lecture, Schema Functions. Thank you for watching this video. I hope this overview was helpful and illuminating. Please don't hesitate to contact me with any questions you may have about the material. I am always happy to help.